right, we're going. All right, so I'm Miles Cupp. I'm an instructor in Kron Martial Arts. I've been practicing HEMA since September 1st, 2010. I've been sport fencing, even many years before that. So my background is more in German longsword, Italian rapier, but I like all the historical sources. I like to study everything. So today, what I want to try and give to the HEMA community in some small way is just an introductory lecture on Fightbook analysis. So reading between the lines, because one of the things that I'm a strong advocate for is not just reading the source itself, but looking at the source in its entirety as part of a greater context, as part of the context of the time from which it came. So we're going to talk about a couple of those different things today. We're going to talk about, first of all, what does Kron study, just as a specific thing in our own chapter, so you understand a little bit more about where I'm coming from. We're then going to talk about the different types of fight books that there are, different types of masters that existed, what to look for in a fight book. When you pick up an original primary treatise, what should you look at when you're reading it? And what are some of the common mistakes that people make, in my own opinion, my own humble opinion, when they analyze fight books? And we're going to look at an example of how does one analyze a fight book, just a small little piece. And I'm going to preface this whole conversation by saying we're talking about medieval sources in particular. We're going to talk about some early Renaissance stuff, but beyond the 16th century, we're not really going to have time to go there. So what does Kron study? Well, Kron studies everything. Well, you can't study everything, but so what do we focus on? We focus on German longsword of the Liechtenauer tradition. But when I say we study everything, I mean that there are people in Kron who like to study Scottish backsword, they like to study catch-as-catch-can wrestling. We like to look at all of this continuum of historical European martial arts, but our foundational tradition that we study is the Liechtenauer tradition of longsword. So we're going to talk quite a bit about that today. Now, of course, okay, Liechtenauer tradition longsword. Well, isn't that all that there is? Isn't that all that we have to go over? Isn't one manuscript the same as any other? I could pick up Ringek and read him and pick up Dobringer and read him, right? Just simple as that. Well, only it were as simple as that. We're going to look at how it's not. But let's first start off by then talking about the different types of fight books that we have access to. Now, these categorizations, I'm taking some cues from the Liechtenauer and some of the research that's been done by Mike Chittister. He's probably going to see this lecture and then tell me all of the different ways that this could be expanded or restricted because he likes to do that. And that's fine, I'd love to talk to him more about this. But this is where we're going to go with it. So we're looking at Hausbücher, Fechtbücher, Ringbücher, Kriegsbücher, Turnierbucher, and Sketchbooks. So let's start by going through these one by one. So let's start with some of the earliest, which are the Hausbücher. So Hausbücher is a house book. It's created by and or for a rich person who can afford to have a book like this created. And it's not intended to be distributed to the general public. This book was only ever meant to be seen by the guy who owned it. Maybe other extended members of his family and other people that they were interested in showing it to, but when we talk about private, right, we're not talking about wide distribution. Maybe only a dozen people might have ever gotten to see this book when it existed. So it's going to contain a very eclectic collection of interesting things. Whatever that guy who created it and paid to have it created thought was interesting. So the way that I was thinking about it on the way over here is it's kind of like a medieval person's MySpace page, but way expanded, right? So you're going to find different pieces of music that they found interesting, different recipes that they liked. Some Pinterest could be tossed in there. And fencing could be thrown in there too, but these were not always about fencing. So Hausbücher is actually a broad term that can apply to a lot of manuscripts from the medieval period, but in our own context, we're usually interested in the ones that contain fencing, because we're fencers. So the MS3227A is an example of that. It has fencing in it, but it has a lot of other things too. So it's not designed to be just a fencing book. It is much more than that. And by looking at the surrounding context of the other content of the book, you can get a better glimpse into the character of the person who paid to have it created. And that itself is also interesting because it sheds us some light on under what context were they fencing. When he prescribes a technique, what context is he expecting this technique to be used in? That's important for us when we study these. But let's move on to the next one. Let's talk about Fechtbücher. This is a catch-all term for any book that deals with armed combat. Okay? So in the medieval period in particular, this is rarely the work of a single author. Okay, it's going to be a collection of works, again, because sometimes these Fightbooker could be Hausbücher, but as a Fightbook in and of itself, sometimes these books were created where it's all just the fighting. But very rarely was it ever necessarily the work of a single author. You would have, at least in a couple of examples, you'll have André Liegnitzer right next to Ringek, right next to another master, and it's all just going to be whatever the person who created this book could get their hands on, put it all into one book, and then there they go. They're going to run with that. Of course, there are some examples of single author treatises like Fiore di Oliveri, Le Jeu de la Hache, the famous French Pollak's treatise. Some of them exist that are single author, but not as many as you might think. And like I just said, they're a collection of different authors, weapons. So you'll see a lot of eclectic things. You'll see wrestling, you'll see longsword, you'll see messer, you'll see dagger. They're going to try and get their hands on as much as they can because this art form in this time period is being spread around organically. Masters are traveling around, studying with different people, collecting fragments of treatises that were maybe created by a single author, and those are lost to us, these fragmentary pieces, but they survive as part of the collection, is what I'm trying to say. A couple of examples would be like the Codex Wallerstein. The beginning of the treatise starts off with a very particular style of artwork and a different scribe's hand, and it's about longsword, it's about falchion, it's about dagger, and then in the middle of the treatise, completely different artwork style, completely different hand, and it's all about wrestling. And then at the end of the treatise, again, completely different artwork style, completely different hand, is all of this stuff about judicial dueling, about armored combat, and then all of that then found its way into Paulus Hector Meyer's hands, and we'll get to talk about him later. And another example of this would be the Dresden treatise for MS Dresden C48-7, the Pseudo-Ringek. Okay? And you can look these all up on the Wichtenauer. Go there and check them out. They're pretty neat. And then we get to the Ringbooker. It's a subset of the Fightbooker concept. But don't think of wrestling as a separate tradition from all of the other stuff. But we do need to talk about these books in their own right, because wrestling is something that, as far as martial arts goes, is something that people in these time period, if they are martial artists, and even if they're not, they're going to be doing it since they were kids. They're going to be playing around, wrestling, games, tournaments, things like this. Like this treatise right here from Fabian von Auerswald and his very famous Das Grublein wrestling game, where you've got one guy standing on a divot in the ground or on a little mound, and he can pivot around that point, and the other guy's got to walk around on one leg, hopping, and the objective is to throw the other person. The one guy has to stay hopping around, the other guy has to keep his foot on that. If either one of those conditions are broken, they lose, and if one guy throws the other guy to the ground, they lose. So, what else do I want to say about Ringbooker? I had a train of thought there and I just lost it. If I remember it, we'll come back to it. I won't sit here and try and come back to that. Now, the next type of book we have is the Kriegsbücher. These are a really interesting subset of martial arts books in the sense that they have more to do with warfare very, very specifically, less so than personal dueling, which you see in most Fightbooker, dealing with one opponent in a dueling context. These talk about siege warfare, the greater context of medieval combat as we can understand it. And there's a lot of very strange stuff in there. Most of it is based on the imagination of Conrad Kaiser, because he was the one who originated the most famous one of these, which is the Bellefortis in the early 15th century, I think 1408, somewhere in there. I could be wrong about the exact year. And all kinds of fanciful inventions are in there. We're still debating which ones of these actually existed. But we know trebuchets existed, so there's a model of one from Talhofer from 1459. So Talhofer repeats a lot of these concepts that are in Bellefortis, because this particular book was widely copied. It was hugely popular because of how you conduct warfare during this time. And there's some other strange things that make their way out into the Fightbooker that we study, like this diving suit, which I had no idea that this thing existed until National Geographic did a special on Talhofer's 1459 book manuscript, and they recreated this thing. They built it to historical materials, they got a pair of bellows, John Clements was working these bellows, and they're pumping really hard, and they kept a guy underwater for about 20 minutes before they just got bored and brought him up. And this is a diving suit. This is exactly what the guy says in the book. He says you can take a jousting helmet, put it on to provide some support around the guy's face, pump some bellows through that hose, and you can keep the guy underwater for as long as you want. Who knows if this thing was ever actually used and or in what context? That's another thing I would love to learn more about. But even the fact that this type of thing existed tells us more about the technological sophistication of the people that we're studying, which in and of itself is something we should pay attention to when we're talking about how much thought did they put into their own treatises. Quite a bit, because these are not cheap to produce. They're very expensive. Let's move on to the next one. Tourneur booker. So tournament books. So these are important for us because as far as we are interested in when we talk about recreating historical tournament fighting, because that's always a debate in the HEMA community. You know, what tournaments can we do and do them to historical specifications, whether it's unarmored or armored. Tourneur booker can give us some insights and some clues into that. It gives us a glimpse into the historical aspect of the sports because they needed to practice just as we do, and they had just as much fun bashing each other around as we do as well. So you can see catalogs of arms and armor in these treatises, things that were safety equipment that they designed and created for their tournaments. You can read about the rules and the customs of the tournaments in these tourneur booker. But these are not in the Fightbooker category necessarily. They're not talking so much about Bloßfechten as much as we would like them to. So when people who are looking at that context of German longsword may miss these and miss the context of the art that's being talked about, because remember, these books are still contemporary to the same period we're talking about, that mid-15th century period when German longsword is being written about in other manuals and manuscripts. You want to come over here and take a look at these, even just so much as a glimpse, to recognize that they're there. And one example of that would be René d'Anjou from the 1460s. So let's go on a little bit further. So let's now talk about sketchbooks. This is more of a modern designation, I would say, but it still exists in that period. And, unfortunately, these images are coming out very poorly. But many artists used fencers as models for their work, because I mean, why would they do that? Well, they're the athletes at the time, right? Fencers are going to be in their top physical condition. They're going to do all sorts of things in addition to fencing that we know about from reading contemporary etiquette books about things that gentlemen were expected to do. And amongst fencing was vaulting on horses, lifting rocks, doing all of these physical feats. So when an artist is looking to find the best models for whatever it is he's trying to illustrate, he'll go and ask the fencers to pose for him. And two particularly famous artists who were in this category, you could say Albrecht Dürer, Martin von Heemskerk. I'm sure I'm butchering that, but that's the best I'm going to do. So what these guys are useful for is useful for supplementing text-only treatises, in the sense that when you have a treatise that only has text in it, and you have an idea about what the technique is describing, but there are certain subtleties that you'd like to find out more about, you can come to these sketchbooks and find some of them. For example, Albrecht Dürer illustrated a lot of things that were in Codex Wallerstein. And Martin von Heemskerk, I think, also used Codex Wallerstein as a source. I think that's where that one on the right is coming from, if my memory serves me correctly. So these models who are performing these techniques would be familiar with those techniques, and while it's not illustrated in the treatise as well as we would like it to, this artist can illustrate it for us. And we get a much, much better view of the technique as it was understood at that time. We're going to talk more about what I mean in just a minute. So now let's talk about the different types of fencing masters. These books were all created by somebody. So now let's talk about the people who created them. So 5 distinct categories. Again, I'm taking some cues from Mike Chittister. He and I can talk more about this stuff on Facebook, but I'm going to roll with it. So you have 5 distinct ones. You've got poets, you have glossators, the illustrators, the interpreters, and the preservers. Let's talk a little bit about each one. So the poets. They're going to be our earliest type of source, because when writing is still actually, in some ways making a comeback in the medieval period, on and off, during the various times when the medieval period was rising and falling, because it was a dynamic time, the poets are going to be the ones who are going to continually be keeping their own martial traditions alive. And they're going to create these poems to be catchy, because that's the way in which you remember things in that time period as a mnemonic device. So you want to be able to remember very easily what it is you're talking about. And this is true for stories and songs and all kinds of other things that they did, but we're interested in the fencing. The other useful aspect of them creating these poems is it shows a pretension of culture. So fencers can sound a root it by being able to memorize these poems, recite them, teach them to nobles, find their ways into courts, get patronized, earn a living. They're trying to make a living just as we are, and so they're going to find an angle on this, and we need to understand what that angle was. So the bottom line to all of this is that it's an oral tradition, and the way that it's expressed for us in the Liechtenauer tradition of longsword is in the Zettel. And the Zettel being, of course, the mnemonic poem that is attributed to Johannes Liechtenauer and spread down, passed along in this sort of secretive way, because the purpose of the poem was to be deliberately obfuscate the meaning. That unless you're initiated into this tradition, you're going to have no idea what is in this poem, which actually is going to bring us to the next type of type of master, which is the glossiter. So the glossiter can be initiated into this tradition, and as writing is becoming more available, becoming easier to do for whatever reasons, as the social construct of the period may have allowed them to do, they're going to take these poems and they're going to write them down, but in addition to writing down the poem, they're going to write down a description of the poem. So they're going to write a gloss. So it's class notes of a kind. So if the poem says, you know, as he cuts right, you cut left, or whatever it may say, well, let's expand on the greater, deeper meaning behind that. Now, there are not many original glosses that we have access to, at least in the Liechtenauer tradition, but there are four primary ones. There's the Kuchner, Pseudo von Danzig, Ringeck, and I meant to put over there Pseudo Dobringer, because Dobringer didn't actually write the gloss on Liechtenauer. That one is anonymous, but again, it's one of those books that was multiple authors all plumped together, and Dobringer's name happens to be in it, so it got attributed to him, and so we still call that one the Codex Dobringer. So then, once we have these glosses written down, which is what gives us the textual insight into the Liechtenauer tradition, then we go a step further and look at the illustrators, which is pretty self-explanatory. They took the glosses and they put pictures to them. So Paulus Kahl holds the distinction of being the first known example of somebody taking Liechtenauer's Zettel, the Markverse, and putting pictures on it. But it wasn't a gloss in that particular case. Paulus Kahl didn't ever gloss the Liechtenauer tradition. He just put the Zettel above their heads and said, you know, as he cuts, take away, demonstrating the Abnehmen technique. He just put it there and showed one picture with one guy on one side, next picture shows the guy on the other side. You figure out how to get there, or better yet, pay him to teach you how to get there. But then you can have some more elaborate treatises like the Goliath treatise, which contains a repetition of the Liechtenauer Markverse, in addition to very, very detailed illustrations and descriptions from the gloss showing how to perform the techniques. So we've got our illustrators. Who else have we got? Well, we've got the interpreters too. Because we have to remember that this art form spans many, many, many centuries. Okay, we're talking about a tradition that probably stretches back to the 13th century, 13th, 14th century, and people are practicing it into the 15th century, even the early 16th century. So over hundreds of years, this art is going to get garbled. It's going to get changed, it's going to get adjusted, somebody's going to misunderstand something, somebody's going to come up with their own idea. So these people are trying to make sense of this garbled art and repeat it, write it down throughout all these years. So these treatises are spread across centuries, and they love to name drop Liechtenauer because they love to connect themselves to this ancient, secretive, lost tradition, even though these guys are just members of the middle class, as is in the particular case of Georg Wilhelm Hutter, who is notorious for having the treatise with the pretzel guy selling pretzels next to the longsword fighter, so I couldn't resist putting his image here. And if you want to see the original source of that image, go to the Liechtenauer. So there we've got our interpreters. Well, then we come to the next one, the preservers. So now, like I said, we're getting into the 16th century now. The art is already hundreds and hundreds of years old. The social structure of Europe is beginning to change. New weapon styles are starting to come in. Rapiers are becoming more popular. People are still fighting with swords, but they're fighting with different kinds of swords, adapting new methods of combat, and also have to adapt to changing laws. For example, the Catholic Church outlaws dueling, so can't duel as much as it used to, at least publicly. So the mindset is going to be is altering. So as that mindset alters, the art form starts to die out. And so I skipped some of my own bullet points, but I think I mentioned these. The evolutions in warfare. It's also changing. Musketry is becoming more prominent, so you're going to see much less usage of melee weapons on battlefields, at least as a first resort. The evolutions in sword technology, I did mention the rise of the rapier. So these particular people are going to come along and they're say, we don't want this art form to disappear. It's part of our heritage. It's part of our identity of who we are as, in Wilhelm Meyer's case, as Germans. This is a Germanic, noble, knightly art. Again, even though he's a member of the middle class. Keeps calling it this knightly art, and we need to preserve it, and we need to make sure that all these young whippersnappers know what this history and this heritage is. Wilhelm Meyer is one of those guys, and Paulus Hector Meyer is one of those guys. And he goes about his life collecting old manuscripts, old treatises, buying them left and right with the money of the people of the city of Augsburg. Eventually gets found out and is hung for his trouble. At the age of, I think, 63, early 60s, he gets found out by a disgruntled clerk and they hang him. And on the Wigton Hour, you can go on there, look him up, and I think they have the picture that was found in a history of executions book, and it got linked to Paulus Hector Meyer. So it's another one of those examples that I would love to point out of finding out more about these characters that we love by studying things that seemingly have nothing to do with fencing. Why would we learn about executions to learn about the history of fencing? Well, because one of the greatest preservers in the history of HEMA happened to be executed. Now, one of the things I want to mention about the preservers in particular, because I picked this particular image, is that the preservers went out of their way to document forms of combat which would not have been of interest to the real knightly classes of the medieval period, like peasant weapon fighting. Sickles, scythes, flails. Meyer is the only one that I'm aware of who has these traditions documented, but because his own mission was to preserve these things, he writes them down, and we are able to find out more about the techniques, the styles. Maybe he made some of it up. We don't know what his original sources were, because there would have been no written sources, I would propose pretty safely, for sickle combat. But here's the bigger point. By learning through Paulus Meyer, we can find out even more about other types of things that are of interest to other historians, like peasant revolts, which happen on and off all throughout the medieval period. They don't have access to swords as much as they would like to, so what are they going to grab? Their farm tools, whatever sharp steel object they can get their hands on that they were using to till the fields. So who knows what we could find if we knocked on this door a little bit more? Could we learn more about peasant revolts, systems of peasant dueling, by then studying the revolts specifically, and then coming back to Paulus Meyer and finding out more? There's an idea for some research. I haven't done any that way, but it's just one example of, again, tying these different sources together to create a greater context of this picture of medieval Europe and Renaissance Europe that we would love to know more about. All right. So all of these details, all these things that I've been talking about, and we're still only talking about the Liechtenauer tradition of longsword all this time. And things get different when we get beyond the 16th century, because once we get beyond the 16th century, we have now printed books, wide dispensation of written knowledge, more middle-class individuals can afford to buy these things, more middle-class individuals find themselves in situations where they can be assaulted and get into fights. For example, if you're a 16th, 17th century merchant, there are no credit cards, there are no checks, or any of those things. So whatever money you have, you need to carry it with you if you intend to buy anything. So if you're a merchant, you're nicely dressed, you're walking around these back alleys of these Italian, French, Dutch, English cities, and you're going to be a prime target for robbers. So you're going to, by necessity, want to know how to fight with these swords. So you're going to be a procurer of books, whatever you get your hands on, purchasing private lessons in fencing, and then class notes from those private lessons survive in the 17th century. So again, once you get beyond the 16th century, things just explode out. There's so much stuff to look at. And you start to see a lot more fencers creating original works. Because remember, when we went back and looked at the different types in the medieval period, there was a lot of copying, a lot of reinterpretation of work that other people had attributed to them. But when you get to the 16th century and beyond, you see a lot more an individual fencing master who has his own practice creating a book and publishing out there. Capoferro, Fabris, Manciolino, Dall'Agocchie, Vigiani, all these people who had their own schools write their own original books. That even if they're taking their cues from earlier traditions, at least in the case of the Bolognese school, Marozzo is still written by Marozzo. He's not just taking everything Dall'Agocchie said, repackaging it and pushing it out the door. He has some of his own original concepts in there that are his, that he put his name on because it's the Renaissance, so you're going to sign your name and run with it. And when we get even beyond that, into the 18th century, you get Domenico Angelo, you get much more widespread access to treatises with new weapon types that are distantly related to the earlier types, like such as the rapier is to the small sword. There's a connection, but we're starting to get so far beyond that earlier period that we need to have a different frame of mind when we talk about them. So anyway, let's now talk a little bit more specifically about, well, what do we need to look for when we look into a fact book? I've mentioned a lot of exceptions and caveats and this, that, and the other thing. So what should we look at? Well, the first thing I think you should look at is, when was it made? Whatever it is that you're studying. If you're going to study MS 133, or if you're going to study Fabris, first question you need to ask is, when was it written, when was it made? Okay, is it written in an earlier time with a different philosophical context, or is it written at a later period where they had access to a printing press? It's your first question that you need to ask. Second question you should ask is, who made it? Is it an anonymous treatise? Is it a known treatise? Is it written by a fencing master who that's his profession? Or is it written down by some rich nobleman who learned a couple of interesting fencing techniques one day, scribbled it down in his house book, and then ran with it? So that establishes the social context of who is it that is performing these techniques, which gets us to the next question. Well, why was it made? Again, was it written by some rich nobleman who thought that was interesting and put it in his house booker right next to his favorite alchemical recipe? Or was it created, as it was again in the case of Fabris, to be a presentation piece to a king, to be published, to be disseminated throughout the kingdom? Or is it made, as in the case of Filippo Vadi? Some people propose that Vadi's treatise was meant as kind of a resume to the Duke of Urbino, to say, hire me for a job as your fencing master. Or was he already in the job as the fencing master and he's just creating this book for that particular noble? You need to ask that question too. Why was it made? What is the purpose behind the book? Fourth question you ought to ask is, well, who got to read this thing? Again, coming back to it, is it intended for private consumption, only ever meant for that person's eyes, and it is something that they could never have imagined that 500 years later there'd be some crazy middle-class people on the other side of an ocean that maybe hadn't been discovered yet who are reading this thing, and they could never have imagined that, so we cannot read their book as if they had imagined that. But of course, if you read Giganti's work, hey, he might have suspected that someday, hundreds of years later, people would still be interested in his work. Who knows? I'm sure he would have been really happy to know that we are as interested in his work as we are. But who got to read it is also just as important for understanding who got to practice it. Is this work intended for a knightly class? Is it intended for even a lower class of people? For example, if you're describing messer combat, knights are going to know how to fight with big knives, but so are the lower classes. So when you look at books that have to do with messer fencing, there may have been a wider audience who would have practiced those techniques and had access to people who did practice those techniques and could learn how. The next thing you want to ask is, well, what's in this thing? What is actually in it? Is it longsword? Is it messer? Is it wrestling? Of course, these are obvious questions to ask at this point, but you also should ask yourself, well, what is the other non-fencing stuff that's in it? What is in it that has to do with the etiquette of how you're going to perform this duel? Or even more peculiarly, because I'll mention